Thank you, Richard. Okay, so what I'm going to talk to you about today is coaching through the lens of diversity, but from a different perspective. So I did qualitative research, I did some informational interviews, researched some of the salient practitioners in the field, and also some people from corporate. And so I got a lot of insight from all over, and also from my personal experiences in coaching through this lens of diversity. And so what I found was, if you know this concept of the iceberg culture, it really helps you to bring home the point of what do we mean by coaching through the lens of diversity. Because a lot of times the words don't do it justice. But before I start, I want to take you there. So let me give you an activity to do. And just grab one. Just grab one. Anyone? Grab two, pass it down. And so what I want you to do as I'm passing this out, read this scenario. So each of you are going to have a different scenario. Okay? Read the scenario and answer the questions. Okay? So I'm going to give you 2 minutes. So I just want what comes up for you. Okay? Quick 2 minutes, just write down, answer those questions and see what comes up for you, then we're going to talk about it. Give me another 30 seconds. All right, so volunteers, tell me what came up for you, Maria.
So the situation, I am moved to Japan. Tomorrow is my first day, and all my coworkers are going to be native Japanese people who are also fluent in English. The first question is, what stereotypes do you think they will have of me? And obviously, I look very Hispanic. Yeah. So Japanese people seem to be very quiet and in service of others. And I think the first stereotype is, maybe Mexican, noisy, like to party, disruptive, out there, and they're not like that. So.
Okay. Yeah. All right, thank you. Somebody else? Anybody else? Share your scenario and share any of the questions that you just want to see what came up for you.
Mine was a similar scenario, except I'm being moved to New Delhi, India. Same questions. What stereotypes do you think my new colleagues would have about me? So American, female, ugly American, plus the female thing, obnoxious American kind of perspectives. I think I would think in that culture I could be at risk for being excluded, or even untrusted, or discounted.
Okay. Somebody answer number 2 for me. Somebody give me a scenario and tell me how you answer number 2.
Oh, I think that for me it was there would be a lack of trust through.
Well, give us your scenario.
Oh, Kenya.
Okay, so read it out.
Okay, I've been relocated. My job has been relocated to the international division of your company's regional office in Nairobi, Kenya. Your first day is tomorrow. All of your colleagues are native-born Kenyans who speak fluent English. So how do I think? The stereotypes that I said were, well, the home office is trying to take over, typically, right? Americans, they all have big ideas, they're going to come in and try and take over. So that was my number one. And my number two on that, how those stereotypes might affect my job performance and promotability, was really just having a lack of trust, somebody coming in from the outside and having biases against, how I support teams.
Okay, thank you, Mo. One more person, and this time answer number 3. So give me your scenario, and then read out the question number 3, and just think what came up for you. Dave, thank you.
I mean, mine's exactly the same, except I'm in Beijing, China.
Okay.
Okay. So for me, how can a coach support me and the organization? From my perspective, it's identify ways to overcome those stereotypes. What can I do to influence or diminish those stereotypes? And then the other is around integrating into the culture. What are things that I can do that show that I'm there to help integrate into the culture?
Okay. So I heard a lot about trust, stereotypes. Some of these kind of differences around how do you, let's say, integrate or assimilate. Okay, so there could be many, many things that can come up, and we won't have time to go through them all, so please bear with me. I'm going to try to leave enough time for Q&A so we can have more questions. But what I wanted to do was to help you feel and understand what it's like for the underrepresented minority in the U.S. context, okay? Because at any point in time, you can be the minority, depending on where you are in this world, right? And so that context will change depending on where you are. And then some of these things that come up for you, it helps you as a coach to be able to say, hey, this may be showing up for my client. And it's especially in the case where you are coaching members from underrepresented groups, which I'll get into in the presentation. So what I'm going to go through is very quickly, why D&I coaching is relevant, what does the research say about D&I coaching, following up on what Richard talked about, how to develop some competencies around D&I coaching, and then some models and frameworks to support, D&I coaching, and finally, just some suggestions for coaching sessions. So this research that I did was, basically what a lot of you were talking about. Some of these biases and stereotypes and things like that come up, but that are particularly relevant when we talk about underrepresented employees in organizations, okay? And again, whatever that context of underrepresented employees may be is going to change depending on where you are. But what you have to acknowledge as a coach is that these things are real. And as soon as you dismiss them or diminish them or devalue them, you've lost your coachee. You've lost them. Because regardless if it doesn't show up for you, as soon as the coachee senses that you're like, no, these things don't matter. Hey, you can still, just push forward. And then they're going to say, okay, you're not hearing, you're not even recognizing this is something real for me, and that I may need to go deeper on before we can move forward. And so you miss a coaching opportunity. And the research supports this. And so when we look at some of these things that happen when underrepresented groups members of underrepresented groups are trying to accelerate their careers within organizations, well, a lot of these problems, the things that they psychologically have to deal with, and also these are actually barriers in the workplace. So there will be a scarcity of role models or mentors. There will be, insufficient inclusive leadership practices oftentimes. There will be, a shortage of discussion around diversity. So it's almost like, hey, if we're going to talk about it, it doesn't exist. But that doesn't mean it doesn't exist for that person, okay? And so you as a coach, you just have to understand the world of your client, and then how can you help your client show up in these situations? Because sometimes there's coaching that you have to do around the coachee to overcome some of these kind of psychological traumas, so to speak, but then there's coaching at the organizational level as well, okay? Again, what are some things that show up? Why is this real? Why is this relevant? Tokenism, covering, imposter syndrome. I heard some people mention those things yesterday, and a lot of times people will say, well, these things happen to everybody. And like I always say, okay, well, basically imagine somebody who just came back from war, and they just say, hey man, I was in the field, I'm sensitive to sound. I'm just loud noises, I'm very sensitive. And if I say, you know what, everybody's sensitive to sound. Tell me what does that do to that person? Yeah, because I can't just be sensitive enough, and I can't just say, you know what, you it's going to be a little more sensitive to you. So there is something around that. I can't just disregard and say, but everybody's sensitive to sound. There are things that particular groups have experienced that until you put yourself in that position, you're not going to go to that deep level to understand. And the coachee needs to understand that you're going to go to that deep level, that you're going to understand the historical context behind why they are experiencing something or feeling a certain way, whether it's perception or reality. That you're going to need to understand things that are going to help them overcome these problems. So I wanted to highlight GSK because they actually did research within GSK and came up to the same conclusions and talked about, well, why aren't female leaders moving forward in the organization? And so they said, well, they get to these kind of top positions and then they just stick or they leave, but we can't get them any further. And so their research supports a lot of what, internally supports a lot of what, was going on in society with other companies as well, okay? So what the research says, when we look at this onion, so to speak, I'm focusing on this internal part of the onion, where we're just looking at race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender, things that are more the visible characteristics of diversity, but that's just where I want to focus. Okay, you may want to focus at any other location that you want, but my specific expertise and interest would be in that middle part, because that's where there's still a lot of issues, okay? And I want you to read this quote that I thought was very powerful and captures the essence of what I'm talking about. And it says, we also cannot afford to be naive in our coaching about the impact of systemic bias, micro-inequities, and prejudice in its many forms. Being blind to isms such as racism, sexism, ableism, and heterosexism creates barriers with many of our coaching clients. Our blindness can condemn us to superficial conversations about issues of great consequence for our clients, and thus the superficial coaching. That is very powerful because it alludes to what I talked about earlier. If you miss that moment, okay, if you overlook that moment, the rest of your coaching, I'm telling you, is going to be very superficial because you haven't really gotten to the root of the problem. Because that person says, hey, there was something that I really wanted to talk about that is unique to my situation. But if you take what is called an ethnocentric approach versus an ethno-relative approach, then you can miss that, okay? And this, what I'm trying to tell you, goes beyond just race and gender, nationality, citizenship. When you look at this approach from a cross-cultural standpoint, it just helps you to be aware of differences, okay? And those differences can show up, even if somebody looks like you and comes from the same city, there still can be some differences that this approach helps you to say, look, I've got to get out of my skin and out of my world and understand that this person could have experienced something in the same way, even if we grew up in the same household. Some of us have siblings and we grew up in the same household, we're completely different, right? So that's what happens. So then, again, what the research says. So I read a lot from Jeffrey Pelham. So he's one of the guys in the field, along with Brzezinski and Passmore, that you will come across when you do this type of research. And he even talked about how it shows up in that coach and coachee continuum. So you have ethnicity, race, all these different things that are beneath the surface that will show up, that if you don't bring them to the surface, you miss really some deep level conversations that can actually move the client forward to achieve whatever goals they want. So how to develop coaching competencies? Well, here are 5 things I identified that if you want to get into this space, in this D&I space, then you have to have cultural awareness. You have to understand, you don't have to be an expert, but you have to understand Hofstede's cultural dimensions. You have to understand Trumpinar's cultural, he has like some frameworks. There's a GLOBE cultural project, which stands for Global Leadership and Organizational Behavior Effectiveness. And I like that one the best because it has 9 dimensions, and it goes like the performance orientation, your time, rigidness, your time orientation, I should say, gender egalitarianism, are you individualist or collectivist? And so it goes to all of these things in terms of just from a cultural perspective and say, hey, generally people from the US or UK or Europe, they fall in this spectrum. Generally people from African countries or Latin American countries or Asian countries, they fall into this continuum. And where is it important? So for example, if you're coaching someone, and you may say, but hey, we're all in the U.S., so we're all the same. That's not true, right? In the U.S., it's a very pluralistic society. People come from different backgrounds, and so even though we share, this American umbrella of culture, that doesn't mean that we are all just one way, right? And so if somebody has more of an individualistic mindset in terms of, hey, you just need to do things just for yourself, and just all about you, versus a mindset where that person says, yeah, but I'm used to more input from family. I'm used to sharing, you know, more things with the team. And their mindset is different. You may be trying to motivate them on something that they can't get behind. And so when you just understand their point of view, which you're not going to understand from the book, but the book helps you to be aware to ask the right questions, okay? So let the client guide you, bring you to their world. Biases, you have to understand gender bias, race and ethnicity bias, you know, you got to understand unconscious bias. You got to understand the historical context of all these biases. You just got to come to that situation with that awareness, and then you let the client guide you where you need to go. Theories, social identity theories, similarity attraction theories. These things kind of help to explain how these organizations function, and a lot of times you can educate the client on why they are experiencing certain things. And then there's certain models that I'm going to go through that I want to get you right now. So these are the ones that I found that were very helpful to me. I love the Delta approach, because the Delta approach, it has like, it consists of like 5 themes. And it really just breaks down like, okay, hey, you definitely have to understand the cultural values of your client, right? But then what the Delta approach does, it says, but we're not only going to look at just the cultural awareness, you know, a cultural perspective of your client, we're also going to look at what motivates your coachee or client based on their cultural perspective, okay? And so then it has this motivation piece, and it walks you through this theory called the Pritchard-Ashford motivational theory that helps you to figure out, hey, based on this person's culture and based on how, and when I say culture, don't think of nationality, don't think of citizenship, don't think of race, just think of that person's being, what drives that person, what motivates that person. Think of all that stuff beneath the iceberg that you can't see. That's what I mean by culture, okay? So make culture on a micro definition level versus this broad level that you think of when you hear culture, you're just thinking of somebody outside of the United States. No, think of that person's culture, what drives them, what makes them, okay? And the Delta approach gives you a great framework to be able to get into that client's world and figure out, hey, what are the things that I need to modify in this relationship based on what I'm hearing, based on what's showing up for you, they're going to motivate you. And so it's very customized and tailored to that specific person's world. I also found a lot of value in the Universal Integrator Framework. And this is one by Jonathan Passmore, and he doesn't go into a lot of detail about how to lay it out. So it's really just a framework, and then it gives you a room for you to get in and put it together how you want. So I was able to adapt some of the concepts from it for my own model. Again, he does highlight appreciation of a cultural environment, and he goes through 4 steps on how you can do that, okay? And the last one I'll highlight is the Rosinski's 4 steps model. So Philippe Rosinski, he is one of the heavy hitters in the game also in terms of diversity and inclusion coaching, cross-cultural coaching. And again, you see this recognize and accept differences, okay? And so he highlights that and gives you a model on how do you take yourself and the client through this process of recognizing and accepting these differences. Now, this research right here, or this graph, I think shows you what I talked about earlier. When you're getting into coaching sessions, what's going to show up for you, right? And you have to be able to move from these ethnocentric pitfalls into these ethno-relative approaches, okay? That is going to be the key for you to have success in any coaching session when you're dealing with a member of an underrepresented group, okay, within certain contexts, okay? Now, I'm not going to generalize and say, hey, every time somebody looks different for you, you just cookie-cutter approach. No, it's that if you have this framework and say, look, I've got to assume that everybody I meet is going to be different from me, and I've got to figure out what your world is first. But if I try to view you through my ethnocentric world, I'm going to lose something in this cultural relationship. And so I've got to move to this ethno-relative, which is going to just inherently say that you are different from me. In some way, we're different. I don't know yet, but there's a difference. And if I open myself up to hear those differences, I'm going to be able to help you resolve your problems a lot better than I take this approach and just say, okay, here's what you need to do. Or you're driving them, you know, based on what you're just hearing, but you're not allowing them to go deeper, okay? So this is a model I created off of, you know, all my research and my experiences in coaching, you know, sessions I've had with some African-American females that were moving into leadership. I was coaching a couple of people from Portugal that were transitioning as well. One was out of the company, and one was transitioning into a leadership development program. So I had a little bit of the international coaching. And so I was looking at, you know, I was kind of experimenting and trying some of these things out. And at one point I did get, you know, I broke my own rule, and I didn't listen to the person. And so it took me, you know, 3 or 4 sessions before there was something I missed earlier because I was doing an ethnocentric form of coaching. And it really just helped drive the point home that, I really didn't give this person a chance to educate me on what's culturally important for them and what drives them, what motivates them, that's so unique and so foreign to me that I had to get into their world. And once we established that relationship, and once they saw I was interested, and I said, hey, what are some things I can do to understand this particular culture, or how you think the way you do, and things like that, then we got on a level to where I could help drive the relationship and the conversation forward, okay? So finally, self-reflection for the coach. Here's some questions that you might want to ask yourself when you are coaching people that are different from you, okay? Especially in the case of visible characteristics. So we're talking about underrepresented minorities that are within companies and that you may be talking with. What is your cultural profile? So asking yourself these questions. What do you think is the significance of your